I'll start my intro because I'm not the important part of this whole webinar. It's really good to welcome you all here on this very windy and wet Friday afternoon. I hope everyone's safe and no one's travelling anywhere that they shouldn't. Just stay safe, everybody. I'm really pleased to welcome you here. We have been running these webinars all through the pandemic, and we plan to continue them going forward as everyone's so geographically spread and some people are still uncomfortable with going out, and they've been really successful. So do let us know if there's any topics you'd like us to talk about, and you can do that by email on events@womeninfootball.co.uk if there's anything in particular you'd like us to cover. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome our host for today's session, Jess Creighton. She's an award-winning broadcaster and journalist, and she's worked in the industry for more than 10 years for world-renowned organisations like BBC Sport, Radio 5 Live, BT Sport and Talk Sport. Currently, you can find Jess presenting for Sky Sports News and hosting the Sky Sports WSL football show. As a former player, Jess is committed to levelling the playing field and ensuring sport is accessible for all, particularly those from marginalised communities. She's the co-founder of Rainbow Noir, a community group that elevates the voices of LGBTQ people of colour. Her YouTube chat show, B is for Black, provides a unique insight into the lives and experiences of Black and mixed-race women in sport. We're delighted that Jess has partnered with us. This is the third in the series of our B is for Black sessions with us here at Women in Football. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jess.
Thanks very much for that, Laura. Much appreciated. Great to be back with Women in Football for this collaboration with my chat show, B is for Black. Now, today's session is all about allyship and basically how we can be good allies to Black women, particularly in the workplace, although I have a feeling this conversation might spill over into the personal as well, because they are very much interconnected. So we're going to be discussing topics like racism, unconscious bias, and allyship, microaggressions as well. And to do that, we have a really fantastic panel joining us on this Friday afternoon. I'm really happy to see Hayley Bennett, who is Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Consultant and Campaigner. Also Edleen John from the FA, who is Director of International Relations, Corporate Affairs and Co-Partner for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion. And also Jane Purdon, who is the former CEO of WITH, has since stepped down and become a member of the board of directors, so is now director for Women in Football. Sending their apologies is Francesca Brown, actually, who can't quite make it. She's in transit, unfortunately, due to all the travel disruptions and the crazy wind, but she does send her apologies and she won't be able to make it for this particular session. Let's get into it. I also want to say, actually, before we start, is that we will have time for questions. So please do put those forward if you want to ask anything to me or to any one of the panelists. And you can do so anonymously if you prefer. Just let us know that you don't want your name to be read out, and that's great as well. But please do ask questions, because it makes for a better, more robust conversation. There's no silly questions. It's all, you know, trying to learn and become better at what we're trying to achieve here. So let's start. I think what would be key here is to just start with what an ally actually is, for those that don't know. Hayley, would you give us kind of your opinion, your take on what an ally is?
It's an interesting one. I don't know if we'll get onto this, but I have quite a few like mixed feelings about the term allyship. And
so do I. So do I.
I'm sure we'll talk about it then. But I think it's important to define it. But I think just before I do, I think it's really important that we acknowledge that it's not necessarily someone who you are. It's more like what you do, if that makes sense. And for me, allyship is all about using your position of privilege, influence, power, which obviously is linked to privilege, to sort of advocate for others who are from marginalised groups. So maybe you don't share that identity with them. And I think that's like the sort of more academic way of looking at it. But for me, it's around acting in solidarity, it's friendship, it's support. It's sometimes it involves risks, it involves not putting yourself first. And that's for me what allyship is.
We'll come on to why you might have an issue with it in a second, but let's move on to Edleen and say, would you agree with that kind of terminology? Is that your understanding as well, Edleen?
Yeah, I absolutely would agree with that. really good definition. I think for me, I make it really simple and say, for me, it's individuals or people who are willing to show up in instances where their voice may be heard more than others. So I kind of keep it really simple. And for me, that showing up can be all of the kind of different variations that Hayley mentioned: friendship, support, speaking on your behalf in circumstances where it might be difficult to, being an ear and listening. So there are a number of ways in which people can be allies. But yeah, I think that's a really fair definition.
And Jane, I think you described yourself as an ally, wouldn't you? So what does that mean to you? Is that the kind of description that you've heard both from Hayley and Edleen? Would you connect to that?
Yeah, I try to be an ally, Jess, and I've had to do a lot of work on this, and I don't think I'm at the end of my journey. I want to say that loud and clear. You know, I'm not before this group today to go, I'm a brilliant ally. You know, it's all about learning, and I'm still learning. But I think what Edleen and Hayley have describes how I see my journey with it. I like, when I was thinking about it, I thought back to something somebody said to me many years ago when I worked at UK Sport. Something terrible had happened, some dreadful discrimination, a racist incident. And I was talking to one of the chairs of the national governing bodies that we fund. And he's a man, he's a very super successful, super wealthy businessman, but he's North African heritage. And I remember saying to him, Mohammed, how on earth are we going to end all this? And he said, everybody has to look in their heart. That's got to be the starting point. And I think when Hayley talked about feeling, empathy, that really resonated with me. And I guess I think the other thing I've learned in my journey with it, it's not enough to be not racist. That's not enough, particularly when you're a leader, as I was or am. You've got to actively be anti-racist as well. So yeah, that's my tuppenny worth on what it means.
Okay, thanks, Jane. Hayley, let's get into the issues with this word, this particular word, and why at times you might find it problematic.
I think one of the things that I find a bit problematic about it is that, first of all, I think it centers people who shouldn't necessarily be centered in conversations around like anti-oppression, I guess. I think the work that I do, I have a lot of organisations come to me and say, we want to create allies, we want to do training on allyship, but then at the same time, there's nothing put in place. There's not similar amount of spend, resources, time put in place and actually supporting marginalised folks in navigating oppressive workplaces in society. So there's that, which is my main thing. But I think it kind of alludes to what we've all been talking about so far. It's about the fact that it's not necessarily something that you can put and wear a badge and say you're an ally. You've really got to show up, using Edleen's words, and show it in your actions. It's really easy to say you're an ally, but you've got to live that. And it does involve risk, it does involve sacrifices, and it does involve lifelong learning, as Jane alluded to. So I think Jane's contribution there was really important, but I think we shouldn't all rush to try and label ourselves as allies. We should think about how much work is actually needed, and then it's going to be more realistic about whether we're going to bring about the change. And just lastly, I think it's not always an easy thing to do either. I think people want to say, oh yeah, I'm an ally, I'm a good person, I'm kind. But like Jane said, around it being more than just being not racist, it means being anti-racist. It's actually difficult. So I would say sort of describe yourself one at your own risk, because actually it does involve a lot of work.
Yeah, it really does. And I think what we've seen, or what I've seen in the last couple of years in terms of people calling themselves allies, is that it can be invoked to call yourself an ally. I've seen a lot of performative activism in the last couple of years, whether that be on social media or in real life. So when someone says allyship, I have to think, well, what do you mean by that? Because it can mean a number of things, and it don't necessarily mean that you are an ally just because you say you are. So Edleen, why do we need allies? What are the problems that Black women are facing as to why an ally might be useful? In the sense where an ally, as we've described it, is someone who is doing, not just saying.
Yeah, for me, we need allies because we have to recognise whether it's within an organization, within a sport, or indeed within broader society, that we still do have structures that mean there are certain people in positions of privilege, there are certain people who have more power than others, there are certain people who, when they push against the tide, it's safer for them to do so. And there are certain people who are plagued with centuries and years worth of stereotypes, which means that their actions or the way in which they might behave can be perceived in a different way to other individuals. And so for me, we need allies, because we have to recognize that there are those power structures. And whilst all of our voices should be equal, the reality is they're not currently equal. And so we need allies to speak up, to stand up, and to take action, exactly as I've said. And I get really frustrated, exactly as you said, Jess, around the kind of performative allyship. So I can think about organizations where people will get, a badge to wear to show that they're an ally of a certain community, or a little desk tent card to put on their desk so that everybody can see that they're an ally. And then when it comes to the crunch, or the key moments where actually it's important to speak up, or to stand up, or to have a voice, those people are not always there and are not always showing up. And so I'm really sparing about the people I would call allies in terms of individuals I engage with or people I've seen over the course of my career. But I recognize that in being an ally, there's also a significant responsibility. And we can't forget that alongside the risk, alongside the discomfort, alongside the need to speak up, there's also a responsibility to make sure that we're paving a better way for the generations that come after us. So for me, all of that is encompassed in why we need it. And as it relates to, I suppose, the challenges that Black women are facing, there are many, right? There are lots of stereotypes that are associated with Black women disproportionately. I can tell you definitely over the course of my career, the volume of times where I've had to pause and think, actually, if I say this, are people going to assume I'm saying it because I'm the angry Black woman, or are people going to assume I'm saying it because my point is valid? And what that means is I'm not always empowered or able to bring my full self to a workplace. And that is really, really difficult. And one of the things, I welcome currently about where I'm working is I can bring my full self to the workplace, but I've definitely been in scenarios and situations before where that isn't welcomed. The intersectionality point around being female and Black is another element that we struggle with. And there are certain perceptions, certain views, and certain stereotypes where people have certain views about what being a Black woman is. And let's be clear, we're not a homogenous group, right? So we have to recognize and acknowledge that as it relates to the journey that we're all on as members of society and in the world of sport as well. So there are a number of challenges that we're facing. And look, I could spend an hour just talking about the challenges, but I won't, because we want to hear from other people as well. But yeah, it's definitely a journey, but one that we all have a responsibility to contribute to.
Oh my God, so much of that I can relate to. And I was like almost smiling. The idea of not being able to bring your full self to a workplace or to any scenario is one that I can definitely relate to. Effectively feeling silenced because I know that if I perhaps act in a true way, it could be seen as stereotypical, it could be seen as angry, it could be seen, people don't know how to take me or how relate to how I express myself. And particularly as a communicator, someone that goes on screen to talk to people, that is really difficult. And I suppose something actually I still probably have to battle through even today. Also, you mentioned performative activism and pins and putting something on your desk to show that you are an ally. And now this has happened a lot in the last couple of years. And actually it's happened at many of the workplaces I've worked in where there's a particular cause and we're all told, we're all encouraged to wear a certain pin or a certain badge. And it's got to a point now where I don't wear any. And I do kind of battle with myself in that regard because I feel like, I need to wear the pin because I need to be that visible face that we are trying to battle this, that I am anti whatever oppression there is that day that we're trying to battle against. But at the same time, I thought, well, a pin doesn't change the work that I've done in the community previously. It's not going to change the work that I'm doing. So actually, I think the best way that I can represent is just by leading by example. So I've actually stopped wearing pins now, but that's a personal choice. Not everyone will want to do that.
And it's doing both, right, Jess? So for me, exactly as you say, it's figuring out what works for you. So I have no issues with people who have the pins and the tent cards and then are showing up. What I have a significant issue with, and
the black squares on Instagram.
Correct.
Oh my God, that got me very frustrated.
Exactly. It's the figuring out, exactly as you say, what works for you, but also being true to yourself. So if you're just going to put the tent card and then do nothing else, don't bother. But if you're going to do both, I can see the value in that.
Yeah. Hayley, talk to me.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and I'm sure people listening to this who are trying to learn around what they can do might struggle with what I'm about to say, but I think the thing with allyship and what makes it complex is there is quite a fine like balancing act that you have to do around actually listening to that look in to change just then. I think we do need allies to be visible, so that actually we can go to people for support, or we can we know who's in our corner, of course, but there's a fine line between doing that and I think taking up space that you shouldn't necessarily be in, and like I said earlier, like centering yourself. So it's quite hard to get that balancing act right. But I think in terms of what you said, Jess, I think being a visible ally is showing up when it matters, and actually sort of your experiences and being more visible in that rather than any sort of badge. But I think it's a hard one because I think we do need to identify who the allies are, and I think maybe it's different when it comes to being an ally to Black women when we just look at it in terms of race and gender. But I do think, you know, allyship is obviously something that has been used mostly within football in particular to talk about advocating and supporting the LGBTQ plus communities. And obviously, I think having visible allies there has been sort of proven to be effective to an extent, not necessarily always for Black women who are also LGBTQ plus, but that's maybe another part of this conversation. But I do think, like, if you're listening in, like, we're not saying, you know, don't call yourself an ally, don't vocalize the fact you're an ally, but make sure you're you know, coming through as well.
Yeah, it's more than just a badge. It's our lives, essentially. Jane, you say you're on obviously you've been on a journey and still continuing on that journey. Where do you stand in terms of trying to make yourself visible, perhaps wearing pins, perhaps, I don't know, using your social media to tweet about different oppressions and different subjects? I
think it's a really good question, and it's one I've found challenging, you know, how to get that balance right, and I don't think always I've got it right. So, you know, women in football, when we're calling out to the football industry to change, I love that old phrase of the suffragettes, deeds not words, and we want deeds not words. I can think back to one occasion where we stayed silent on something, and it was my call, and it was because I thought, I don't want us to look just performative. If we're not showing up on this every day, you know, we're not going to do a black square, you know, because to me it just felt shallow. And we had a lot of discussion about that before. We had a lot of discussion afterwards. Some of our members got in touch, and what the conclusion I came to, which was part of the learning I went on, is you need both, actually. I think Edleen said this, you need deeds and words. But I think Hayley has a really good point. And again, there'll be people like me watching this who may be just beginning to think about these issues, maybe beginning to think, do I do enough? Do I understand this well enough? And I would never, someone's making tentative steps to try to understand you know, what the real life experiences of people from other backgrounds from them are like. I would never call them out. You know, I think it's so important we treat each other with kindness, empathy, and of course guide, and of course be honest. So I'd never call them out if they try something and it's not quite right. But again, I think for someone in my position, the leadership role, it's got to be both. It's got to be deeds and words. And we all know, you know, because of some of my intersections and identities, I need allies sometimes, and we all know when it's authentic, don't we? We all absolutely know. You just feel it. And again, that's very much my ambition. Whether I succeed or not, I don't know, but it's absolutely what I'm shooting for, to be completely authentic about this so people know and trust it.
Okay. So how do we go about challenging certain behaviours then? I think Edleen was very clear in mentioning how you don't sometimes bring your whole self to your workplace because you're worried about century-old stereotypes. I know I've certainly felt silenced in some situations during my career because I don't want to perhaps express myself in the way I might express myself outside of work amongst friends. And I suppose everyone to a certain extent has to do that. Everyone has to bring their best professional self to the workplace. That's the whole, that's the whole ethos of going into work and being professional. But I think there is an extra layer that women of color, Black women, have to deal with on top of the whole idea of trying to be professional. So how do you go about, what tips would you give, Edleen, to try and challenge that? Firstly, on a one-on-one basis, and then secondly, if perhaps that doesn't work and you need to get higher powers involved and hopefully have some kind of structure within your organization to fall back on in terms of accountability.
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the points that Jane just made is really critical as it relates to this. So my starting point is recognizing that actually in having to have that conversation, both parties or all parties are probably already uncomfortable, right? So we have to recognize that we're sitting and being in that discomfort, and therefore empathy that Jane mentioned becomes really critical and really important. Now, that doesn't mean that I am going to sacrifice myself or minimize myself just to make somebody else feel more comfortable as I go along the journey of challenging, but I'm going to recognize that I can challenge and ask questions in a way that still acknowledges how an individual feels. So often for me, if I think back over the course of my career in instances where I maybe feel that people are trying to assign a stereotype or a certain trope to me by virtue of something I've said or I've done, what I actually do is I ask them the question why. I'll say, explain that to me, explain to me that why when Jim said the exact same thing, that was completely reasonable, but when I said it, you took it as me being angry or me being emotional or me being any of the other words that might be associated or ascribed to women or indeed Black women. And for me, I find questions are a lot more difficult for people to get angry about versus when you're saying you did X to me or you made me feel like this. And so questions is always kind of my personal comfort route, and that will be different for different individuals. And just as I'm reflecting on it, I wonder if I have created and crafted questions to be my comfort route, because maybe in my younger days when I was very direct, people then would go, oh gosh, she's being aggressive again. And it was kind of like a cyclical action. I think in instances where you're in an organization where it needs to be flagged at higher levels, or you question whether you've obtained a reputation by virtue of being yourself, but those reputations align with stereotypes around Black women. For me, it's about really being open and honest about the negative impact that those stereotypes have, not just on me, but actually on members of the Black community. And so in those instances, I try and depersonalize what it is I'm talking about and say, actually, let me give you scenarios or let me give you factual examples, and then pause and go, and actually I'm talking about myself, right? And it's almost like there's a penny drop moment where people go, oh, okay, gosh, that was horrific when we were talking about this instance. And then you go, but that's my experience here, or that's my experience in this environment. And so it's about helping people to learn along the journey with you, but in a way that recognizes that, yeah, it is uncomfortable, but it has to be.
Yeah, I think empathy is a key. It's going to be a key word throughout this conversation. Empathy and trying to put yourselves in other shoes. How do you go about challenging it, Hayley? When you're consulting for your clients, what do you suggest to them?
I think just to build on what Edleen said, I think one of the things that I always bring up, and it tends to be like a penny drop moment in one of my sessions, is that something that people tend to forget, when they're thinking about how they can call out behavior and action, is actually like checking in on, like in this case, the Black woman who's been impacted by what's been done. Like, human nature says, like, if we see someone who's an aggressor or someone who's in the wrong, we're like trying to think, how do I challenge that? How do I get the right amount of adrenaline to say, like, that wasn't right? How do I stand up for this person? Like, directing our attention energy at that aggressor. And then a lot of the time, like, there's definitely been situations where people might have pulled that person to one side without me even knowing. And I've gone home thinking, none of my colleagues had my back then. No one understood that I was really upset, or maybe I was the only person that noticed that, because like most people tend to take like these conversations offline, or they'll have that on a one-to-one basis. So something that I always encourage people to do is to actually check in. And it kind of goes back to a lot of stereotypes about Black women being like super strong, not needing that emotional support, or being hostile. But actually sometimes, like, I can give an example here. You hear someone make an inappropriate comment in a meeting. After that meeting saying, oh, I can't believe that person just said that, are you okay? It's just as simple as it can be. even if you're struggling to think about how you challenge that, it's so easy to like show empathy, to go back to that point and check in with that person. And that is allyship. You can then think about if you haven't got that experience, because the reality is standing up and asking those kind of questions, even, it does sometimes require experience and gumption that some people just don't have that practice of. Checking in with somebody is like the absolute bare minimum you can do, and it's super easy, but it often gets forgotten. And I think the other thing is like reporting situations or escalating it. If you don't know how to deal with it, talking to somebody else, like a manager or another colleague, and saying like, this wasn't right. I think a lot of the time we let things go that we know are not okay, because we didn't in that moment think that we had the right tools or the language to challenge it. But there's always things that you can do afterwards. Obviously, it's best in the moment, but you can't always do that.
Yeah, I suppose that's why I asked about, if you can't do it on a personal level, how do you then, you know, escalate these situations? Because for a lot of Black women, I'm trying to think of back to myself, my own experience when I was younger. I think the thought of challenging that directly with the person that had made an offensive comment probably didn't enter my mind, because I thought, well, I'm junior, plus I'm a woman, plus I'm Black. There's literally no point. And I don't believe that I will be safe if I call out this person's behavior. So I didn't. And, you know, I think there are a lot of people that can relate to the fact that they just decide not to say anything and they silence themselves. Is there anything you can say to those people if they don't feel they have the backing of their company? What can they do? How can they make themselves feel safer in that instance?
I think for me, having a support network is so important, and having people who share those similar lived experiences to you can go to. And actually, like, the biggest tool that I have is like WhatsApp groups where I can go, oh my goodness me, I cannot believe what this person just done. And just getting off your chest is something that's really helpful. But, you know, something that I've learned, like, I've had to do a lot of learning on this topic myself, and I've gone through specific like therapeutic training on this. And one of the things that, going back to what we've just been talking about, we shouldn't underestimate is like how good it feels to hold somebody accountable for what they've done. Because when we do let things go, and I'm not victim blaming here at all, we can obviously build that resilience. We get on with our lives, we go to work, we see that person the next day maybe. But the reality is it does eat away at us. And if we do challenge it, it does like such a big thing for our mental well-being. So I do think that is, not something we can underestimate.
Yeah, so I suppose sometimes it's just having that courage. Edleen, what would you say, Edleen, in terms of kind of tips for Black women in particular that are wary of coming forward to speak up?
I think it's about figuring out and finding a way to do it that is authentic to you. And as I say, if I think about my career journey and my journey along the way, there are many times where actually I maybe didn't call it out in the right way. And to your point, that's ridiculous to say, right? Because if you're the victim, why are you there spending time thinking about whether you've called it out in the right way? But actually, all it has led to is an individual getting defensive, or a relationship not being able to properly mend in a good way for the foreseeable future, or me feeling like I've done something wrong and then feeling even worse about the scenario or the situation, or thinking, am I being too hypersensitive, to the point that Hayley made, right? Because if nobody else has said anything, then maybe it's a me thing. And so for me, in different instances, I've just figured out different ways to do it. So humor is one of the ways in which I've definitely challenged people before. And even in my time in football, when I've heard or seen things and I go, hang on a second, this doesn't feel, or this doesn't land right. Having those private one-to-one conversations, like Hayley says, pulling somebody aside, but sometimes also recognizing when you're in a leadership role that sometimes you do have to do things in a more open forum, so that people recognize that as a leader, there are things that you will or won't stand for in a team or in a function or in a setup. And equally, you know, I've lent on people. So sometimes where it's difficult for me to have that conversation, or I recognize that there's a power dynamic that is off if I challenge, then I've had allies who I've gone to and said, actually, maybe you could tell me what your perception is of this, and maybe you could support me by having that conversation. And so it's just figuring out a way that's authentic to you in the circumstance and in the scenario, but recognizing that that will feel different for different circumstances, different situations, and different power dynamics.
Wow, yeah, great tips from both of you there. I'll bring in Jane, and also just to let to know everyone listening, the chat feature is now open. Please send us all in your questions or insights or comments. Like, there are no silly comments, there are no silly questions. Get them all in, and then I can ask them to this esteemed panel for you. Jane, a lot of the talk that I've noticed for people that aren't part of the Black community when they're discussing this area is, oh, I feel a bit awkward talking about this, or I don't quite feel comfortable challenging someone that's made an unnecessary comment. How do you get over that? If you're not Black and you have to challenge someone that's made a racist comment or stated a microaggression, how do you get over that and just challenge it?
Just do it. It's not rocket science, just do it. I actually want to come back on the previous discussion because I was sitting there listening, and I want everyone in a leadership position and who manages teams just to reflect on what was just said and look at the energy you three lovely ladies have had to bring in your careers to deal with what is in essence racism, right? You know, people treating you a certain way. And what a waste of your energy. One of the most powerful things I heard early on in my journey, I think it's a comedian who said it, and I can't remember who, but he said, you know, it's not up to Black people to end racism, folks. He's actually talking to white people. It's not on them, it's on us, you know. And like that, the point about if you're a leader, you I think there's no excuse but to aspire to create a team where people don't have to do that. Everything you've just described and all that energy you can bring into being your brilliant selves, that's so important. But to go back to your question, Jess, how do you challenge? You know what, it can take courage. It can, you know that you're going to create a bit of social awkwardness. You know that it might slightly, you know, just put a little fault line in the relationship between you and whoever the person is you're speaking to. I will be honest again, I'm not perfect. Sometimes I've let it slide, but sometimes I've just thought, oh, no. And I've challenged it, just do it. I think in a work situation, again, if you're managing a team, you're in some kind of leadership situation, you've absolutely got to. You might, depending on your reading of the situation and the person, do it offline, do it online, remind the meeting about the kinds of behaviours that are expected or whatever. And I think the other thing I would say for anybody who's nervous about it is that, like, it's like anything when you do it for the first time. It's a bit nerve-wracking, but it gets easier. It gets easier. And again, you find your way. You find your way to do it. I always say also about anything, not just about on this topic, but about anything. If you need to kind of pick someone up on something, talk about the behaviour. Don't talk about them. Talk about the behaviour. Because they're people. They'll have lovely, wonderful parts to them as well. So just to depersonalise it can take some of the kind of stress and angst out of the situation.
Okay, hopefully those are tips that everyone will find useful, I think. Now, we've been coming at this from obviously a moral standpoint, you know, just don't be racist, but actually there's another angle to this, which sometimes is lost, and probably, you know, rightly so, because we need to talk about empathy, we need to talk about sympathizing with victims and ensuring that it's the person that's been perpetrated against that gets the majority of the kind of airtime in this situation. But actually ensuring that microaggressions, unconscious bias, racism does not happen in your workplace makes business sense, because you are becoming more inclusive, you are becoming more diverse, and you are appealing to a wider range of people. Hence, you can employ a better range, you would have thought, from a wider pool of people, and keep those people happy. Do you talk about that at all, Hayley, when you're doing your sessions? Do you talk about the fact that it does actually make financial and business sense to make sure that your business is run correctly and not, you know, allowing staff to be racist and perpetrate microaggressions?
I do and I don't. I think definitely a few years ago, it was absolutely necessary to do that, to get people on board. But I think nowadays there's such a, I mean, you can talk about it being a business case, but nowadays I think a lot of organisations, especially the ones who come to me, because I don't really sanitize the work that I do. I tend to push people quite far. So people come to me expecting that. But there is definitely more of a link between an organisation's or aspiring or actual like values that they have, rather than it wanting to be something to do with their bottom line. It's to do with their company's purpose, etc., or the leaders' personal values. So there is that. But I think how I tend to talk about it is, if you are someone who's experiencing microaggressions, a culture that's not inclusive, not being able to be themselves, they are not going to be as productive as you would want them to be. They are going to have to expend energy, as we were all just talking about, combating how that culture is impacting them. So even if you were to hire people in the first place, it's such a waste of that talent in an organisation. And also people will leave. Like, I think especially in football, people talk. Like, there are not many black women and most people know each other and will be sharing experiences. So let's like not underestimate the power of word of mouth. So I think you want to keep on to talent, you want to keep your reputation. And I do believe in like the carrot approach, but I think stick is important too. There's definitely risk involved.
Yeah, totally. Edleen, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I'd completely agree with that. I think it's about recognizing that there are different ways to skin a cat, so to speak, right? So there are different approaches that will work in different scenarios, and recognizing that people are different. So people will respond and react in very, very different ways to very, very different circumstances. But again, for me, it boils down to responsibility and accountability, and recognizing that actually, as forward-thinking organizations, be that in sport, be that in anything else, if you genuinely do want to win in the marketplace, and whatever that means to your organization, then you can't do that with just one certain type of people. And so the business case is important. So I agree. I think we've had shifts in society, which means we don't necessarily need to make that case as regularly as we had to in the diversity space 10, 15, 20 years ago. But actually, there are some people who still do struggle with it. And let's recognize sometimes people struggle with it because what it is it's a challenge of the status quo. And it's a recognition of the fact that some people are in positions of power, not necessarily because they are super amazing at anything they've done, but because the way in which structures within organizations or society have worked have given those people a leg up. And so when you have those conversations, what you're doing is you're challenging a system and saying, actually, is this a meritocracy? And that becomes really, really uncomfortable for people who go, hang on, am I not as good as I thought I was? And we need to be honest and have those conversations.
Yeah, you've raised such a really kind of timely point, because in a lot of the conversations I've had with people that aren't from the Black community say, what do you mean I have privilege? I don't have privilege, I'm working class. Or I don't have privilege, I'm a woman. Or I don't have privilege, I'm LGBTQ. But what we are, I suppose, need to establish is what privilege is in terms of this discussion, and why certain people feel they don't have it when in fact they do, Hayley.
Can I jump on that one, Jess?
Yeah, sure.
And I'm just going to take a moment here to plug Hayley Bennett, because I don't know if a lot of people know this, but she and I worked together for about a year, didn't we, Hayley? And we called it kind of black to white mentoring. It was hugely helpful, and she's brilliant. And if anybody is interested in taking this a little bit further, speak to Hayley. But we had this conversation once, I don't know if you remember it, Hayley, and I said exactly the same thing. I said, I don't get it, because as I never tire of telling everyone, I'm from Sunderland, which is not the most advantageous area in the country. I'm I get accent policed all the time, by the way, like what I sound like I come from Sunderland and all of that stuff. I'm a woman, surely these things count against me. But Hayley really helped me unpick all this, and I saw that actually within that there were huge privileges. I come from a middle-class family. I went to the kind of school which sends kids to the best university that's not even thought about. It's just like, oh yeah, we'll put you on the path for Oxbridge and Red Brick and this, that and the other. And I came to understand what white privilege is. And I do think it's a thing. And I totally get it. It's just like, there are little things and big things which will just be different for me because I have white skin, and I totally get it. So, and we also had this conversation. I don't know if you remember this bit, Hayley, but you introduced me. You said to have a look at Black Twitter, and I went, "Well, there's a Black Twitter." You went, "Yeah." And I had a look, and it was brilliant. And I came back to you, and I said, me being so passionate about Sunderland and the North East, I said, "Do you know what? We don't have Northern Twitter, and we need to." And I actually took away from that. There's things I could learn from Black Twitter about some of the other causes that I'm kind of passionate about, really. So yeah.
Yeah, and it's recognizing with race and ethnicity, and I always say this as I think about privilege, it's not about downplaying or not recognizing any of the other historically underrepresented or marginalized groups that you mentioned, Jess, but the reality is I am a born and bred Southeast Londoner. I can tweak and change my accent and speak very well and speak the Queen's English, and I can bring the ghetto when I need to bring the ghetto. The reality is, the one thing I cannot change is when I walk into a room, you see my big, round, black face. And that is the reality, right? I can't hide that. And let me be clear, there are many people who have tried to hide that in different ways. There have been, even if I think of, my name is Edleen John, actually my family are originally from West Africa. My middle name is an African sounding name, and it was only during COVID that I found out that actually Edleen isn't on my birth certificate, right? So it's things like that. And then you have interesting conversation with your family where they go, you had an older sister, it was really hard for her. We recognize the importance of trying to get you to fit in because we were an immigrant family, and then you had an English other name, right? I only discovered this in the past 2 years. And as I say, I've been working in this D&I space for years, and I'm not 18 anymore, right? So I've lived a long life. But for me, that was a realization of going, actually, how have my experiences and how have I been privileged equally in a very different way to my parents many, many years ago when they got here, where for them, that was the only solution. So I think it's recognizing that privilege comes in different shapes and different forms, in different times in people's lives and in different societies. But it's also recognizing that there are some types of privilege which we can mask and others which is really, really difficult to do so.
Yeah, totally. Wow. Thank you for sharing that, Edleen. My goodness. We've got some questions coming in. But I have to say, Jane, I'm so glad you gave a shout out to Black Twitter. Wonderful.
I wouldn't do without. Honestly, I've learned so much, Jess. And I'm just sorry, because I'm not going to hog the mic, but the other thing I would say to anybody who's thinking of setting out on this journey and really going to just research, understand Black experience in the UK, whether it's reading books, going on Black Twitter, listening to podcasts, is a lot of people say to me, like, oh, that must have been so hard. And do you know what? It was an absolute joy, mostly. The pain, it's very difficult to deal with, of course. But what did I find? I found so many brilliant people, so much wisdom, so many great writers.
Yeah, lots of celebration, lots of humor, lots of memes. Black Twitter, great for memes. Right. Someone's a very another timely comment here, saying, let me just make sure I've got this right, that people think privilege is about money when it's about how you navigate the system. That's very true. I think that's been echoed by our panelists. We've got a question here from Rose. How can we make sure we're being allies without speaking for Black women or taking up spaces for Black women? I think you mentioned this as sometimes why, Hayley, allyship might be seen as problematic. Any tips for Rose?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. I think especially in the football context, and I remember when I did a session for with members on this, we talked about this a bit. Like, one of the things that I see happening in football a lot is, obviously within our networks, we tend to obviously advocate for our friends, people that we connect with, and we tend to keep advocating for the same people and tend to be like very similar people taking up space. And of course, we know that women are minority in the football space, but I think sometimes I feel like white women could give up some of that space for women of colour, in particular, Black women. I think as well, passing the mic. So when you are asked to speak around issues, you can think about the space that you might take up. Like even me today, like being a Black woman of mixed heritage, of lighter skin, like I'm conscious of that my experiences will be very different to Edleen's and yours, Jess, and actually acknowledging that. And actually being ready to come to the table and acknowledge that if you're being asked to talk about your gender or sexism in football, for example. Like, I remember, I think probably in the last couple of weeks, there's been a lot of conversations about like misogyny in football, and they are coming at it from a very much the lens of white women. So how can we actually expand that conversation, and think about what are we missing here? And sometimes that is like passing the mic or talking to people, but yeah, actually advocating for them and paying people as well. I think one of the things I said in the WIF session as well is like, especially in the football space, we get really annoyed when we see all male panels. I think we need to be just as angry when we see all white women panels, which I know a lot of organisations are looking to change, but it's something that does still exist. And part of that is actually just expanding our networks. And it is a bit of a tough one, because I'm sure you've both felt this as well. Like, we don't want to just hear from the same people all the time. It's not about tokenism. It's actually about trying to find like new voices, and yeah, acknowledging people's expertise.
Yeah, totally. That tokenism thing I can really relate to. I've stopped doing interviews really. I've stopped going on panels as well. I'm doing this one, but yeah, on the whole, I feel like because I am a bit more visible, perhaps because of my job, that I might be the first port of call for someone, but I'm not going to be that person anymore, without trying to sound too negative. Another question has come in here. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. A question to Hayley. In your role as a D&I consultant, do you have any recommended resources for allies to learn more about privilege, power, and how to step up as allies, specifically for the Black and mixed race community that comes in from Roman? I'll get your thoughts on that because that's addressed to you, Hayley, but also it might be good to hear from Jane on that point and the resources that you've used to further your knowledge.
There's a couple of sources that I always go to if people ask me this. I think Nova Reid has a book called The Good Ally. Recommend that. Obviously Renee Adiologic's book around Why I No Longer Talk to White People About Race is a good one if you're starting out. What I would say is, to be honest, the resources that I think are super like on it for this, Natalie Morris, who writes for Metro, she is always coming out with amazing articles. So if you just Google like Natalie Morris and look at her articles she's got on the metro.co.uk website.
Just released a book as well, isn't she?
Yeah, she's written a book around her mixed race experience as well. So they would be the ones that I would go to. I'll try and think of some like better sort of video and audio examples, because I know not everybody learns from reading, but Nova Reid has a podcast as well. And there's actually a podcast called Race Reflections, which looks at it in quite a lot of depth. I'd say get through some of the other learning first and then go into that, because that will look at things like, in a lot more of a deeper lens, from like a lens of psychology as well.
Okay, great. And Jane, what resources have you used and who have you spoken to that's helped you?
So this is some of the ones that Hayley's mentioned, because some of this stuff we worked on together. I also found Slay in Elaine, a good book. I really like novels. That's kind of my thing. And good books I've read by Black women, which again I found helpful on my journey, are, obviously Bernardine Evaristo, that's really well known. There was a staggering book published last year called Assembly by Natasha Brown, and that is, I don't know if anybody knows that, but it's the story of a Black woman who has everything this society has to offer, everything, including Mr. Darcy, by the way, who happens to be white, but Natasha Brown just shows you how it's still not working for her, and you absolutely see why. And I won't, no spoilers, but it's absolutely, I found it quite devastating actually. Just as an account of the Black British experience. Then the other novels the other writer I've read recently I really like is Jennifer Mukumbi, who's Ugandan but based in Manchester, and she wrote a book of short stories called Manchester Happened, and that's terrific. I love it. It's like partly a Ugandan novel, partly a Manchester novel, but she also writes her second novel, Kintu, was sort of set in Uganda, both Uganda like pre-colonial and now, and not so much about the Black experience, Black British experience, but Black history, who's ignorant about it? Me. And that for me was just a helpful way of really kind of getting into it, learning about a completely different civilization. Can also plug Hayley again. She does a fantastic free email packed with resources, which is super helpful.
I actually forgot I did that. So
great resources there. And Hayley's just put in the chat group, if everyone can see that, the season zine, they publish some great things around football and race, and they've actually got a guide to being anti-racist, and that was a publication that's been around for a while now, quite a few years, founded by Felicia Pennant, who is absolutely amazing as well. So check out Season. What else? Oh, Edleen's mentioned some things here, white fragility, how to talk to a racist as well. All really powerful resources, guys. I hope you've got your pen and paper out to make a note of these. Yeah. Really good. That actually is a key phrase, I think, white fragility. Edleen, how would you actually describe that and how it relates to the conversations that we're having today about this? Because again, when Black women are trying to think about how best to come up against someone that's perpetrated against them, white fragility can sometimes scupper those plans.
Yeah, I think it's exactly almost as you've described it, Jess. It's the fact that sadly the society within which we live today, still, if you are a Black woman and there are people who may be saying or doing things that are inappropriate, you are second guessing yourself because you're concerned about another person's fragility, who is the person who's actually the aggressor. And so for me, white fragility, and I think again there are different forms of fragility, is that automatic defense mechanism that comes up when somebody might ask you a question or somebody might challenge you on something, which in some instances is by virtue of ignorance. And I don't mean ignorance in a negative sense, but ignorance through just the lack of knowledge and lack of awareness. Sometimes I do think, though, actually white fragility isn't just about a lack of knowledge or lack of awareness. Sometimes I think it can be more purposeful, where it's not about, or it is about, sorry, not recognizing that your experience is different. You do have certain elements of privilege. And I think Jane's been really honest in how she sort of shared and gave her experience, right? So it's where you might be talking about something as a Black woman and somebody might say, oh no, but that was really similar for me because actually this was my life experience, or that was really similar for me because this was how or where I grew up. And it's about recognizing that that isn't necessarily pausing, stopping, listening to the lived experience of an individual. And I have to say, I really welcome what Hayley even said, even as women from ethnic minority backgrounds, Hayley's experience as a light-skinned woman is going to be very different from my experience as a darker-skinned lady. And we have to acknowledge that that brings about different challenges, different nervousness, and different elements. So, yeah, I appreciate I've kind of banged on a bit, but that for me is encompassed within all of that.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And I think I myself have had to come to terms with there's certain privileges that I've had in my life as well. I might be dark skinned, but I had parents that were both present, who encouraged me to get an education, encouraged me to go to university. Some people don't have that, so I had to also go through a process of understanding where I fit in within this spectrum of so-called privilege as well. And I think that's what everyone needs to do. Everyone needs to just maybe take a little bit of a look in the mirror. It's all very important. Got one more, probably got time for one more question before we have to wrap. But before we go to that final question, I think on the conversation around white fragility, Edleen, is very interesting. And I don't know how recognized that term is, particularly to people that might be listening. I've definitely experienced it myself, and it stopped me from perhaps trying to counteract or combat the kind of nonsense that I've heard coming out of people's mouths. Trying to think of an example so people know, and I'm not just skirting around the edges. But I've had someone say to me, in relation to me, talking about me and saying, this is great, I can't wait to have mixed race kids. And I was like, wow, really? Like, really? And then when I actually stepped up the courage to tell them that that is not okay, what you said is not just problematic, it's actually quite racist, they then started to cry. So that's what we're talking about. By them crying, it centers them. It makes me look out to be like some kind of perpetrator, like I'm just being mean in bringing up what they're saying, when actually it was something that should never have been said, was very racist, and they didn't even realize, or said they didn't realize what they'd said was wrong, and instead switched it around to say that I was the one being mean. That's what we mean by white fragility, in case anyone was wondering. That in terms of an example, it literally centers the person perpetrating. Yes, Jane.
Yeah, sorry, Jess, I didn't mean to interrupt you. It's really important, but it's a bit of a tangent, it's not directly related, but again, one thing that I learned, which is so important, is like, we all have biases, and most of them are unconscious. Some people do consciously act in a discriminatory way, but I think sometimes people's unconscious biases can be touched. And again, I'm kind of trying to speak to a white audience here. You may find that might happen to you. And again, this is where I think being really in tune, really empathetic, really stopping, listening, and engaged listening to what the person is telling you is so important. And again, be kind to yourself. You know, if you've got unconscious biases, welcome to the human race. We've all got them. It's recognizing them and what you do about them, which is the important thing. And sorry, just one more tangent quickly, but this is really important. Women in football, we can offer pro bono legal support to any women in football member, not just women, non-binary people, men as well, who suffer discrimination in the workplace, in the football workplace. So please do bear that in mind, anybody listening who's going through that.
Thank you. Okay, that's fantastic, Jane. Thank you for being so honest in your answers today. One final question, because I did promise you, I'm wary of time. We've got a couple of minutes left, so maybe just a quick couple of lines from all of you on this final question. They say, I'm loving listening to this discussion. Thank you so much. I was wondering how you think allyship should come into better representation of young Black girls and women getting into football. So how does this all tie in to making football, I suppose, more inclusive, Hayley?
Well, I think I'm going to pin it on what's happening this year. We've got such a big opportunity in the UK with the Women's Euros. So those of you who are working on anything to do with that, make sure you're looking to include Black women and young Black girls, I think in particular. We know we're not seeing the representation we want to see of Black women in the Lionesses squad, for example. So I think like a really practical thing is like ask those questions, think about how you can include Black women in any events, marketing, etc. you're doing for this year, and talk to your clients or your team members about how you do that as well.
Mute myself, sorry, Edleen.
For me, in addition to what Hayley said, it's about thinking about opportunities and ways in which you can be supportive. So when I think about when I played football as a young child, I was lucky enough that I had somebody who could drop me off and pick me up at football, a parent or a family member. And actually there were other individuals who didn't have that. Now it would be really easy for the person who was dropping me and picking me up to do that for another individual who maybe didn't have that support. And that might have meant that more people could engage and continue to play football. And often when I speak to the Lionesses or I speak to particularly Black women in the elite end of the pathway, that's one of the challenges we've faced across the football system, where a lot of our talent centres or our talent ID centres have been based in areas where it's difficult to get to from a public transport perspective, or they're based out in the lovely leafy areas where you need a 4x4 to get to. Now, from an FA standpoint, of course, part of our strategy is to look at how we shift and change that. But in the interim and in the time that it's going to take to develop that, because we recognise that, again, women's football is not as financially invested into by corporate sponsors in the same way that men's football is, actually each and every individual can play a role. So if you have, children yourself that you're taking to football, recognise and look around, and maybe there's somebody who could do with a lift, who wants to keep playing or participating. If there are instances where you recognise you can ask questions of your local football club or your local county FA, or indeed the professional football club that's near you, ask those questions, because I think it's important for people to hear and recognise that voice, not just from those of us who are working within the kind of football authorities, but individuals more broadly.
Thank you, Edleen. And final thoughts, Jane?
Yeah, so we work closely with the football industry, more on the kind of off-pitch side, and to every organisation in football. I think Hayley's right, we have such an opportunity for everything on question of gender and race as well, to take another quantum leap this year. We would say open the door, welcome people in, make sure you're coming across as a welcoming organisation, create opportunities if they don't exist, share the opportunities that come across your path, celebrate your people, all of them, and make sure you're doing that you are celebrating all of them. And yeah, you know, and be open to feedback. And again, on behalf of women in football, you know, I've had feedback recently we weren't doing some of this particularly well, and that actually resulted in a very positive conversation. But we are open to it, and on behalf of women in football, if ever anyone thinks we're not doing this well, please let us know, because we want to do it well.
Brilliant, all of you. It's been absolutely amazing. Hayley, Edleen and Jane, thank you so much for your insight, but also practical solutions that everyone can use and take forward as well for their future learnings. And finally, this t-shirt, while we're bigging up and advocating for Black women, was designed by Zem Clark, who was nice enough to design me a t-shirt for my B is for Black series. So big up Zem, thank you for that. Search her out because she's a great graphic designer and she's freelance and always looking for opportunities. So that's great. Thank you everyone for joining. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your questions, and thank you for being so engaged. I'll see you at the next one. Thanks so much.
I just thank, on behalf of Women in Football, Jess, Hayley, Edleen and Jane for taking part today. I found it really enlightening. We all strive to be better every day. I actually learned such a lot from Jane when I joined Women in Football, and it was really important that she was part of this panel because she is certainly one of the white community that is showing us how we need to do better. So thank you, and thank you all. We will be running more of these with Jess and with some other of our fantastic members over the coming weeks and months. Just keep an eye on the website. The events will be on there. We've got a webinar next Tuesday. Do check it out on the website. Other sports are available, talking about other things apart from football and opportunities for women. And have a fantastic Friday. Stay out of the rain and the wind and enjoy the evening. Take care now. Thank you.